The Sobibor Extermination Camp, Poland, World War II. On October 14, 1943, a group of Jewish inmates and prisoners of war launched an insurrection. Knowing they were facing death or worse, they had made a careful, secret plan to quietly assassinate the top SS officers one after the other, take their weapons, sabotage the communications infrastructure, kill the remaining guards, take over the armory, open the gates, and let the rest of the prisoners escape and join the partisans. At the time that I'm recording this, Israel has just invaded Rafah. The official death toll far exceeds 30,000, with presumably tens of thousands more buried under the rubble. Forced starvation continues with barely any aid coming through, and university campuses around the world are becoming sites of rebellion where people confront their states and institutions' complicity with genocide. The horrors continue, but so does resistance, with Palestinian armed factions fighting back ferociously in Gaza, with Hezbollah continuing to pin Israeli forces to the north, and with Ansarullah in Yemen continuing its naval blockade. By the time I get around to publishing this, there will likely be some new Israeli atrocity and new development. The situation keeps changing. Al-Aqsa flood and the Gaza ghetto uprising are still unfolding, and a lot of what I say might become dated within days or even hours. So I'm trying as much as possible to think of this video as an evergreen essay, as something that could hopefully stay relevant after the news cycle will inevitably move on. I heard about the attack first thing in the morning of October 7th when I checked my phone and saw the family WhatsApp blowing up with messages. My older sister lived until October 7th in one of the kibbutzim in the Gaza envelope with her kids, and they were locked in the safe room for the day and were luckily able to flee the area. But I'm not here to talk about my own situation. I'm here to talk about October the 7th, its aftermath, Israel's genocidal response, the guerrilla defense, the uprising, the history and present of Israeli counterinsurgency, the military philosophy behind it, and how everything changes in the Middle East now, how to make sense of this, and what we can possibly learn from this theoretically, tactically, and strategically. Sounds like a lot? It is. So, within these murky, contested, still shifting historical grounds, within this fog of war, what do we know? And how do we know it? I'll get to that, but first, just a few sentences on context. Gaza has been cut off from the rest of Palestine since 1948. The lives of around 2.3 million people in Gaza have been all but defined by siege and imprisonment for decades. The introduction of the permit system and the first sweeping closures started in the early 90s, and the full siege was declared in 2007. In effect, it has already been subject to genocidal conditions for years, but it was a kind of slow genocide, or creeping genocide, or what Israeli historian Ilan Pappé called an incremental genocide, already in 2006. Let that sink in. Gazans have been exposed to conditions calculated to make life impossible for decades. Most Israelis, myself included, have never been to Gaza. My sister and her children lived less than a kilometer from Gaza until October 7th, and they have never been there either. All we know about Gaza is mediated and abstracted through the fallacies we're fed in the press and the schooling system. So Gaza is a black box, right? A free kill zone, what Achille Mbembe calls a death world. Gaza is essentially a holding pen since the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine, an open-air prison to hold the refugees who survived back then and their descendants. Israel's National Security Director, Giora Eiland, called Gaza a concentration camp in 2004. Over the years, it's become a lab for the testing of Israeli weapons and surveillance technologies. It has experienced multiple large-scale military operations. Eden Lando counted 12 since 2003, with a death toll already in the high thousands. And it's a place that has already been declared by the UN as unlivable, unfit for human life in 2018. So the people of Gaza have nothing to lose, right? What would you do if you were facing genocide? George Orwell wrote a great essay about Gandhi's response to a similar question in 1938, so before hundreds of thousands and then millions of Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Gandhi's view was basically that the Jews should non-violently commit a kind of mass suicide which, quote, would have aroused the world and the people of Germany to Hitler's violence. It seems totally unhinged, right? Orwell thought so too. But at the Great March of Return in 2018-19, the people of Gaza kind of did that. This was the Palestinian equivalent to the Gandhian Salt March of 1930. The Palestinians marched protesting against the siege towards the prison fences, and they were gunned down en masse by Israeli snipers as the world stood and watched and did absolutely nothing. So what would you do? Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who was the architect of the 2007 siege, actually answered this question himself once, saying he would have joined armed Palestinian resistance had he been on the other side.
I was new enough in politics to tell the truth that if I were born Palestinian, I probably would have joined one of the terror organizations.
So it is within this context that we must understand what happened on October 7, 2023. Israel thought of Gaza the same way people think about prisons here in the US, as a place that contains or warehouses violence, right? But prisons actually produce violence. It flows out of the prisons and into our seemingly removed lives. That's why moralistic questions on violence are beside the point. Fanon talked about this too, that the violence inflicted by colonialism on the native returns like a boomerang. This occurs abstractly, but also very physically, as demonstrated by the simple fact that about 15% of Israeli bombs dropped on Gaza don't actually explode and are then collected and repurposed by Palestinian resistance groups to construct their own rockets and IEDs. Israel has so far dropped the equivalent of more than 5 nuclear bombs in Gaza. Israelis can thus expect to receive the equivalent of 1 nuclear bomb in return fire at some point in the future. Now, what was the purpose of this war? Security? To talk about October 7 without this context is simply a failure to think dialectically, or in other words, a failure to think. Viewers might remember from my video about Fanonian dialectics that it is through violent resistance that the native asserts their humanity. Fanon writes, "The native knows that he is not an animal, and it is precisely at the moment he realizes his humanity that he begins to sharpen the weapons with which he will secure its victory." The dialectical process and its tearing apart of identity, the identity of both the oppressed and the oppressor, and its violent destruction of colonial rule is a terrible, painful process for everyone involved. But that's simply the reality that we have to confront. Was that more than a few sentences of context? Probably. So, what actually happened? What happened? In one sentence, October 7 saw a devastating guerrilla attack that defeated the IDF's Gaza division and captured hundreds of Israelis, including high-ranking army officials, who will presumably bring the freeing of Palestinian political prisoners and set the resistance on a trajectory to bring down the apartheid regime and/or achieve Palestinian statehood. That's the macro scale. The details, as far as we're able to gather from Israeli military, Palestinian resistance, and press publications in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, as well as from dashcam footage, GoPros, phones, and surveillance cameras, as well as me, binging on witness accounts recorded on both sides of the fence, and obsessively reading every military analyst I could find within the sea of data confounded by misinformation and counterinformation and fake news and actual information. What happened was this. Around 6 a.m. local time, the Palestinian resistance launched a meticulously executed attack and, as I argue, also a popular insurrection against Israeli military bases and settlements surrounding the Gaza Strip, deploying a wide array of forces on sea, land, and air, and underground. And by the resistance, I mean the plurality of factions and unaffiliated individuals opposing Israeli siege, apartheid, and colonization in Gaza and outside of it, and this includes, of course, the armed Palestinian factions, most prominently Hamas, which stands for Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, the Islamic Resistance Movement, as well as Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the PIJ, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, which is a Marxist-Leninist organization, but also the people who joined in once the Israeli security apparatus came down. The armed factions started with what the Israelis are calling a diversion, launching an unusually extensive missile strike targeting the Gaza envelope and the coast up to Gush Dan, which is the Tel Aviv metropolitan area. Simultaneously, they attacked Israel's panoptic surveillance systems and cameras in and around Gaza with relatively cheap commercial drones with DIY explosive capacities, and then they approached and breached the fence with a large number of forces, probably around 3,000 fighters, blowing up the fences around Gaza in many points. Today I actually read an article saying in 44 points, according to Israeli sources, with specialized explosives, and laying down metal railings over which armed motorcyclists in groups of 2 could ride rapidly. Then heavy construction equipment like bulldozers and front-end loaders moved in to expand the breaches such that pickup trucks and sedans could drive through carrying more armed fighters. Videos show that well before 8 a.m., other factions were in full gear and uniform, ready to participate in the uprising. In this video, which was posted on Twitter as early as 7:58 a.m., which means it was posted by the Israeli source, probably on Instagram or TikTok earlier than that, this video shows the Mujahideen brigades with their white headbands fully ready to go, shooting at a police cruiser in the Israeli town of Sderot in the early morning. So this is the Mujahideen brigades, white headbands, not the Qassam brigades, which are Hamas's armed wing, who have green headbands. With these forces, they completely overwhelmed the Israeli defenses across many locations simultaneously, taking over the Erez crossing, catching soldiers in their underwear in the bases, taking over entire settlements, kidnapping around 240 people into Gaza, and killing many Israelis, including the colonel who commanded the Gaza division's southern brigade, including the mayor of the kibbutzim in the Gaza envelope, called the Sha'ar HaNegev Regional Council, who came out to fight, and many other high-ranking army officials, police officers, and also a team of Shin Bet officers, which is the equivalent of FBI agents. And I just want to say, kind of off script, how wild it was to watch this unfold in real time. Being a person who has participated in protests against the apartheid wall, for example, who was arrested and taken into these settlements, or like into Israeli settlements and taken into military bases, and seeing them from the inside as these kind of impenetrable fortresses that are always overflowing with soldiers, and then to suddenly see Palestinian fighters roaming through them and humiliating Israeli soldiers was just completely mind-boggling, and was honestly like a life-changing event for me personally. In this moment, I felt really afraid, right? Because I had family in the Gaza envelope at the time, but I was able to suspend some of my fear and some of the knee-jerk reaction that I saw many of my Israeli peers falling into, largely thanks to Fanon, the philosopher and revolutionary, whose works I have studied, pretty extensively, because Fanon helped me translate what I was seeing into a historical moment that is larger than my personal identity and personal history, and allowed me to see that what was happening in that moment was that the natives were surging into the forbidden quarter, to use Fanon's words. And so I could achieve this kind of theoretical separation that then allowed me to come up with this analysis that I'm sharing with you right now. Okay, that's enough for this unscripted bit, and I might cut it because it's too much about me. But I'll ask a friend, and if I keep this, thank you, friend. And if I don't, thank you, friend. back on script. In catching the army so off guard, there was an important element of short-circuiting Israel's surveillance capacities by creating the mirage that Hamas was deterred from confrontation and had no plans to attack. According to Israeli and American sources, there were multiple gatherings of forces in the lead-up that were framed by Hamas as harmless training exercises. There were phone call conversations among Hamas officials saying they had no interest in any confrontation with Israeli forces. There was use of old-school landline phones in an autonomous communications network in the tunnels. Apparently, Egyptian and American intel about the attack was delivered to the IDF, but they waved it away as something familiar and unconcerning. In the previous few months, Israel moved entire divisions from Gaza to the West Bank, assuming that Hamas was contained and banking on technological surveillance and enclosure systems like smart fences and robotic sentries to keep Gaza pacified. Later in this video, I will dive deep into the military doctrine that brought the apartheid state to this miserable situation. In a conversation I had with Tom Nomad on the It's Going Down podcast, Tom mentioned that the Palestinian resistance was not, quote, strategically deficient. They may be technologically deficient, they may barely have access to basic resources for survival, but they're showing that they're not by any measure strategically deficient. Resistance identified that Israel was going through a political crisis internally. In the previous months and years, growing influence by West Bank settlers diverted Israeli military and other resources to the accelerated land grab attempts on that part of the country, deprioritizing Gaza. A growing Zionist middle-class social movement had been protesting Netanyahu and this extreme right-wing government with escalated methods, blocking major traffic arteries, setting up burning barricades, holding small-scale strikes, and even refusing to do military service in the reserves. The resistance was able to identify and exploit these strategic weaknesses in the Israeli state apparatus. Now, to qualify all of this, what happened after the fences were breached and the gates were opened was that then thousands of Gaza residents, or inmates, right, Gaza being an open-air prison, joined the attack in what became an uprising. And you can watch some of this footage. You can see people from Gaza crossing the fence by foot and taking photos on conquered Israeli tanks, and some of them turning around back inside, but some of them continuing on bicycles or however they could, including on crutches, to loot military bases, and in one case even loot a horse, and loot settlements, and even participate in the attack.
شيل البوابة، خذ السيفون اللي في الحمام، والجيزر اللي مسويها أنا. هات شيل على الفيسبوك بلاش. شيل الجيزر تعال. الجيزر عندي خربان أنا. والله الضوء هذا كويس والله تعال راجع. دمبلز أيوة دمبلز والله حط لي كويسات.
In one of the Israeli eyewitness accounts I read, where this journalist went to one of the hotels where Israelis from the Gaza envelope were relocated, one of the survivors talks about seeing teenagers with stones and machetes next to uniformed, well-equipped Hamas operatives. Personally, I've never seen machetes in Palestine, and he might be confusing this for the fakes that were circulating from Latin America. But the point is that what happened on the ground looked very different than what we're told in mainstream media about a strictly Hamas-Israel war. And this just reminds me, while recognizing the infinity of differences, this reminds me of other historical insurrections, like Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion or John Brown taking over the armory at Harper's Ferry, where the idea was to arm slaves who would then join the fight. But mostly, it reminded me instantly, when I got news from my sister that there was a power outage at their kibbutz, of the Sobibor uprising, because it was so carefully planned and included sophisticated sabotage to communications and electricity infrastructure. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is, of course, the most famous Jewish revolt of that era, and many people made the analogy, including Rifat al-Arir, who generated controversy for drawing this comparison on BBC.
This is exactly like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This is the Gaza Ghetto Uprising. This is not easy for Palestinians. I want to use Hamlet's proverbial sea of troubles. We know Israel is going to kill us anyway. We are starving, we are being besieged, we are being dispossessed, we are being displaced. Israel wants us kneeling, so why not fight back and die in dignity?
The BBC apologized for airing this interview. Rifat received anonymous threats to his personal phone, including someone saying he was an Israeli officer and identifying the UNRWA school where Rifat was staying, and he was soon killed. Rifat was murdered by a targeted Israeli airstrike to the apartment where he was staying with his family, in what Euromed Monitor concluded was a deliberate assassination. The images comparing Warsaw after the uprising and Gaza right now are striking, and I'm just going to take a moment to recognize that Rifat was murdered for making this comparison. There are many reasons to make analogies: literary, emotional, analytical, scientific, political, strategic, even tactical. Pedagogically, the case of Algerian decolonization, as the Palestinian activist Nizar Banat argued before his own assassination, might be the best model to study in relation to present-day Palestinian resistance. And maybe one day I'll make a video about that. But for now, the case that occurred to me most acutely was Sobibor. Sobibor was a Nazi extermination camp where, in 1943, a small group of Jewish inmates and prisoners of war made a careful plan to secretly assassinate the head SS officers one after the other, take their weapons, kill the remaining guards, take over the armory, open the gates, and let the rest of the prisoners escape and join the partisans. And while it didn't work perfectly as planned, they did manage to kill many officers, and they did open the gates and let hundreds of people escape. And while many of them were killed, and everyone who stayed at the camp was murdered, a higher percentage of them survived than they would have otherwise. Never forget that. Now, all of these uprisings were bloody and brutal, and the extent of their success is debatable, but they were a reaction to much larger brutality on a whole other scale. Which brings me back to Fanon again in his second chapter in Wretched of the Earth on spontaneity, and the tenuous relationship between the more organized cadres and the uncontrollable rage of the masses, this rage that explodes from years of misery regardless of morality or the plans and ambitions of the political parties. In Claude Lanzmann's film Sobibor, October 14, 1943, 4 p.m., one of the surviving rebels, a man called Yehuda Lerner, describes in great detail, over 20 minutes, with great pride, how he killed a Nazi officer, splitting his head in two with an axe. Saying, "It was a great honor for me to be among the people chosen to kill the Germans." When the director asks Lerner if he was scared to kill this man, he says yes, but that he had no choice, that it's better than being killed like sheep. One of the ways I've been building an image of what happened is by listening to Hebrew podcasts with Israeli army officials. In podcast settings, they're often like sitting and chatting with their friends, and not necessarily paying close attention to who's listening or to who might be listening, so they're more likely to actually share useful information than in written publications that are much more easily scrutinized by the IDF censorship unit. Footnote: yes, everything that comes from Israeli media, including nominally liberal publications like Haaretz and Plus 972 magazine, as well as everything that comes out of Western media outlets with local Israeli bureaus, like CNN and the New York Times, is subject to Israeli censorship laws and likely reviewed by the IDF before publication, so I wouldn't automatically count on any of these sources. In these podcasts, they do sometimes share useful info. One example is Israeli Air Force Colonel Nof Erez, who was in a war room on October 7th, but was dismissed a few weeks later for speaking against Netanyahu, so he also had an extra reason to spill the tea.
פה זה היה חניבל המוני.
According to Erez, Israel's main command centers around the Gaza Strip were attacked and effectively dismantled by the Palestinian militants already at 6:30 a.m., which meant there was a command and control crisis from which the IDF couldn't recover until late in the afternoon. So the Israeli response was disorganized within a military that already punishes any kind of independent thinking, and that is, of course, so inherently hierarchical and dumb because hierarchy rewards stupidity and conformism and incompetence. However, the main Air Force base for the area, Basis Ramon, which, by the way, was built in 1981 by the US Army, is considerably farther away and was not attacked by the resistance. You can see it on this map. Standby combat helicopters were up as early as 7:15 a.m., according to Erez, and reserves pilots started streaming into Ramon over the next few hours, and even though they weren't able to get a coherent idea of the scale of the attack, the Israeli Air Force was apparently the first arm of the IDF to respond coherently to the attack, while the ground response hadn't cohered until late in the afternoon. But as confirmed in December 2023 by Israel's most popular newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, known online as Ynet, the response when it happened was an implementation of the Hannibal Directive. Named after the Carthaginian general who would rather swallow poison and commit suicide than get captured, the Hannibal Directive is Israel's suicidal, scorched earth response to kidnapping attempts. Early on in October, I did an interview about all this with Silver Lining on the It's Hot in Here podcast, and at the time, I said that it seemed like the Hannibal Directive was implemented, but maybe not officially, that we just didn't know yet. 2 weeks later, as mentioned, Colonel Nof Erez said on the Haaretz podcast that, quote, the Hannibal Directive was apparently applied, and that October 7 was a mass Hannibal. A couple months later, Yediot Ahronot confirmed that at 11:59 a.m., the Hannibal Directive was indeed applied on a mass scale. This involved shelling targets in so-called Israeli territory with Apache helicopters, quote, emptying their stomachs, then going back to the base to reload, and emptying their ammunition yet again, bombing targets on foot, in houses, in bases, indiscriminately firing at will on everyone in sight, as well as bombing at least 70 vehicles. Some of this included even knowingly shelling Jewish Israeli children. You heard that right. In her interview on Israeli radio, survivor of the attack Yasmin Porat describes being treated humanely by her Palestinian captors.
הם לא מתעללים בנו, הם מתנהגים אלינו בצורה מאוד אנושית, זה אומר שהם שומרים עלינו. כן, מה זה אומר אנושית? שומרים עלינו, הם נותנים לנו לשתות פה ושם.
And recounts how over 50 people were killed in, quote, very, very heavy crossfire.
הטרוריסטים ירו בהם?
לא, הם נהרגו מהחילופי ירי, תבין שהיה חילופי ירי מאוד מאוד קשים.
זאת אומרת, יכול להיות שזה כוחותינו ירו בהם? כשניסו...
And by tank shells, not by Gaza fighters, all while the Israeli radio host tries to goad her otherwise, and even though after she was released, she told the IDF commanders on scene that there were citizens and children inside. In this video, you can see footage of the tank firing into a house, and another survivor, Hadass Dagan, the only person to survive Israel's shelling of this house, who described how the Jewish Israeli children inside were screaming ceaselessly for help until the Jewish Israeli tank shell silenced them forever. With no shred of remorse, Israeli General Barak Kheiram admitted that he gave the orders. Another way to think of this could be as what sociologists call elite panic. Namely, after a disaster occurs, whether natural or man-made, state systems break down, and, determined to restore the status quo, elites react by applying a lot of force in an attempt to restore balance. As in Hurricane Katrina, they shoot looters who are just taking food when the economy halts, and as in October 7th, they shoot at all living targets, inflicting on the population a second disaster. When sociologists examine disasters systematically, they find that spontaneous networks of mutual aid, which basically means just regular people helping each other, respond much more efficiently and effectively than state systems in a way that is quite affirming to anarchists. And if you ever find yourself having to read a Rebecca Solnit book, make it A Paradise Built in Hell, which presents a rigorously researched overview of this sociological field over a century of disasters. And what precisely is the Hannibal Directive? Kidnappings have been an extremely effective way for Palestinians to generate leverage against Israel for decades, as the families of the hostages build up pressure for concessions within Israeli society, peaking in the Gilad Shalit deal in 2011, when Israel exchanged 1,027 Palestinian prisoners, including current Hamas head in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, for one soldier. The Hannibal Directive is aimed at preventing this occurrence by all means necessary, including by killing the kidnapped soldier or soldiers, which almost always winds up happening, as with Israeli soldier Hadar Goldin and others in 2014. Since October 7th, this was Israel's logic, in Gaza as well as in the envelope. While I am indebted to Mando Weiss, Electronic Intifada, and others for their coverage of this, here are some additional examples that I observed and that went largely unnoticed. I read an untranslated eyewitness account in Hebrew where an Israeli citizen, while locked in his safe room in Be'eri, which is a kibbutz, describes getting a phone call from an IDF helicopter operator who's like, "Are there terrorists in your home? If so, I'm blowing up the house." That is a direct quote. In Sderot, which is a working-class town, not a gated, fenced-in kibbutz like most of those settlements, Palestinian fighters were able to take over the police station and barricade themselves inside with hostages. The IDF did not negotiate with them. They systematically destroyed the whole reinforced building and killed everyone inside. Haaretz journalist Amos Harel, who is seen as perhaps the most moderate and collected Israeli military analyst, even though he too has been spreading fallacies concocted by the IDF spokesperson's unit about beheaded children and sexual violence, he reported honestly that the South District Division was, quote, compelled to request an aerial strike against the base itself in order to repulse the terrorists, end quote. The same thing happened elsewhere. In footage published by the major Israeli news site that I mentioned, Ynet, as well as by Israeli Channel 12, you can see Israeli helicopter operators opening fire on what they say were 300 targets that day, including on people fleeing from the dance party, and admitting to being unable to differentiate partygoers from Palestinian militants, saying Hamas was instructed to walk in order to confuse the Israeli Air Force, and that they were, quote, in a dilemma, not knowing who to shoot because there were so many, end quote. All of this so far is only from October 7, and that's just a selected sampling. Most of these sources are Israeli sources in Hebrew. English translations are available for most, but clearly Palestinian militants prioritized taking Israelis hostage, alive. Here you can see them specifically sparing these two women. This despite the probability that, like 90% of Israel's secular population, they too have likely had military experience and could have arguably posed a threat. Here you can see them sparing a woman and her child. Here is another witness who was spared, who discusses being treated kindly by the militants who invaded her house.
הם מסתכלים, ואז אחד אומר לי באנגלית, אל תדאגי, אני מוסלמי, אנחנו לא נפגע בכם. אחד מהם רואה על השיש בננות, אומר לי, אפשר לאכול אחת? אמרתי לו, כן, אתה יכול לאכול אחת.
On the other hand, time and again, we're seeing that the upper echelons of the Israeli security apparatus prioritize killing everybody, their own constituents included. Please, don't believe me, go and follow these sources and see for yourself. Now, of course, we're never going to know exactly what happened because Israel is very vociferously refusing to allow an independent investigation to occur. So while there were documented instances of Qassam fighters firing at civilians who were fleeing or hiding, we will never know the true extent of the phenomenon because Israel simply won't let anyone else investigate it, and we just cannot trust their own investigations. A similar logic has been applied in Gaza itself, the logic of Hannibal. Catastrophic shelling, an unending slew of unapologetic war crimes, and utter disregard for human life, Israeli citizens included. Add to that a drawer plan to expel, or if not possible, exterminate the Palestinians, and you get the current situation, Gaza 2024. The scale of the bombing and the pace of the killing has been unprecedented in this century and possibly in history. There are no words I can say that can even begin to capture the horror of it. From the very beginning, Israel has been unable to achieve its military goals, so it responded by attacking and massacring civilians, murdering over 15,000 children and counting. It tightened the siege to genocidal degrees, preventing food, water, fuel, and medicine from entering, causing death by starvation. It's been using an allowance of a trickling of humanitarian aid as military leverage. It bombed any kind of infrastructure imaginable, including sewage, suggesting biological warfare. It used chemical weaponry, including white phosphorus, with no condemnation from Western leaders. It completely decimated all medical services, making medical treatment almost impossible. There are witness accounts saying it has also summarily executed Palestinians.
شلحهم كل هدومهم بس بالبوكسرات وخلوهم يناموا كده على الأرض. بعد هيك بلشوا في الإعدامات قدام عينينا كنا، ما خلوا ولا حد يعني عملوا ساحة دم قسما بعزة الله يوم ما بنتسى ولا هينتسى.
The list goes on and on and on, and it's getting worse and worse as I'm uttering these words. What we're seeing, as claimed by genocide expert Raz Sigal, who happens to also be an Israeli historian, but whatever, is, quote, a textbook case of genocide demonstrated from the very beginning with Israeli leaders' obvious intent to commit genocide, as compiled in this video by Israeli conscientious objector Atalia Ben Abba, complete with blood libel and the manufacturing of false, completely racist narratives to justify the ongoing killing.
Netanyahu is using the word Amalek because he's referring to the biblical enemies of the Israeli people that were described in the Bible. This is what the Bible says about Amalek. Do not spare them, but put them to death, men, women, children, and infants. It is the only nation in the Bible that God orders the Jews to kill completely, so nothing is remembered of them.
Trigger warning, discussion of sexual abuse and torture. Skip this section if you need to. Accusations of rape on October 7 have been the narrative engine of this genocide. I witnessed it first experientially from the very first moment, when I tried to discuss the context of the attack with Israeli family and former friends. They would yell at me about rape, and the conversation would shut down. If I tried to ask for proof, source, or any kind of evidence, they would say, I don't watch snuff videos. If you derive pleasure out of that in your sick mind, you can go on Telegram and see for yourself. I, of course, went through 7 hours of footage on Telegram. I saw many horrible, disgusting, terrifying things, including, by the way, Israelis. Okay, I'm not even gonna say it, but like abusing corpses. But I didn't find any evidence of sexual violence. On social media, asking for evidence became cause for cancellation. Academics and rape crisis counselors were losing their jobs for not adhering to Israel's propaganda, and the Me Too hashtag was co-opted to justify genocide. Most of us were way too slow, way too afraid, and way too overtaken by identity political counterinsurgency to call it out in real time. And I'm speaking about myself. Like, there were brave journalists and activists, like people in the Electronic Intifada and the Grey Zone and Tmando Weiss, who were able to call this stuff out. I was kind of paralyzed in that sense, and right now I'm like choosing to put that paralysis away because the stakes are just too high. At risk to their professional careers, some journalists and writers have gradually debunked every single one of the October 7 rape stories. In my opinion, the most comprehensive debunking to date was written by Arun Gupta for Yes Magazine, but please don't believe me on this. I'm including a partial but extensive list of articles who did the heavy lifting on this essential work in the description. Read them, review the evidence, and decide for yourselves. While the weaponization of feminist discourse for genocide in Gaza might seem new, the mobilization of colonial forces to ostensibly protect women from the colonized savages goes way back. This phenomenon shows up throughout colonial history as one of the prime avenues to legitimize genocide both before and after the fact, as exemplified so succinctly and in such a clear analogy to the images disseminated after October 7 in the 1892 painting La Vuelta del Malón, translated as The Return of the Indian Raiders. This painting works to legitimize the genocidal conquest of the desert in Argentina, is considered a foundational work of Argentinian art specifically and colonial art at large, and it depicts a totally fictional image of Mapuche warriors kidnapping a naked white woman. Remember this next time an Israeli art exhibit comes to your hometown. Anglophone audiences should be familiar with all this from the history of lynchings in the US. They'd remember, hopefully, probably not, but they should remember the 1931 case of the Scottsboro Boys, where 9 black teenagers were falsely accused of raping 2 white women and were convicted and sentenced to death, except for one of them, the 13-year-old boy of them, but he was also accused. One of the accusers, Victoria Price, kept lying that they raped her until her death 50 years later, even though it was decisively proven as false. In their doctoral work, Jameson Austin Leopold highlights how Angela Davis's 1981 essay, Rape, Racism, and the Myth of the Black Rapist, frames the racist ideological fabrication of the propagandistic cry of rape as the major political and sociocultural justification of the extrajudicial institution of lynching. This focus on a phantasmatic black rapist works, in turn, to make invisible the literally countless rapes that go unreported, and, as Leopold argues, the state-sanctioned rape that every single one of the United States' 13 million plus prison population goes through on a routine basis in strip and cavity searches. Similarly, this obsessive reiteration of fabricated October 7 rape stories erases the real, routine, state-sanctioned sexual abuse of countless Palestinians. The trophy images of masses of Palestinian men and boys stripped to their underwear and held in torture positions for hours and days are images of sexual violence. The erasure of the rape of countless Palestinian women and men subjected to routine strip and cavity searches by Israeli forces, as well as those extra-legally violated by marauding Israeli soldiers, is driven by anti-Palestinian racism. Let's be clear, the self-identified Zionist feminists, as well as anyone who reiterates their delusional October 7 projections, are agents of institutionalized, banal, quotidian, and systematic rape. It might be interesting to note that this is classical for xenophobia. As anthropologist David Graeber said, the easiest way to generate hatred is to focus on the bizarre, perverse ways that a different group is assumed to pursue pleasure. Personally, I find the history of blood libel informative in this context. Blood libel is a term I'm taking from my study of my own ancestral history. It's a term that specifically harkens to the genocidal lie that Jews use the blood of Christian children to make their matzah for Passover, Pesach, as a justification for pogroms and worse. Here, this is a matzah. See it? I don't know how exactly you would use blood to make this cracker, but I guess my grandma uses a different recipe. It's a little dry, honestly. Maybe it was wishful thinking on behalf of the anti-Semites, to give it some moisture. I honestly should have brought some blood. It would have really improved this experience, probably. Yeah, I guess the blood was used as a dip. Like, you can't make the cracker with blood. It was used as a dip. So similarly, we're seeing lies about the beheading of children, the tossing of babies into ovens, necrophilia, reiterated made-up stories on sexual violence, the circulation of horrendous older photos of sexually violated Kurdish fighters as if they're Israeli women, references to these obviously fake news photos in official NGO reports, lies about fetuses being torn out of pregnant women that are just straight out of the 17th century Khmelnytsky pogroms, and so on and so forth. All of this has been gradually debunked, but it keeps resurfacing periodically. The White House walked back on Biden's outright lie that he's seen photographic evidence of children being beheaded. The LA Times pulled out an unsubstantiated quote on sexual violence. The New York Times has had an internal firestorm over its own publication of atrocity propaganda. And it also had, the story of Gal Abdouche saying that she was raped, but her family was outraged by the story and said that it would have been impossible for her to get raped between the time that she sent them a message and a few minutes later when her husband said she was killed. This NY Times story has been torn apart by admission of the journalists themselves, as thoroughly shown here, and yet mainstream media remains fully complicit, continuing to pump out unsubstantiated claims that invariably lead back to Israeli spokespeople. It's almost like the IDF spokesperson sits with a button that they can just press to get another bogus NY Times story whenever they need an extra push of legitimacy for their genocide. This atrocity propaganda has been the narrative engine of this genocide, as shown by friend of the show Frank Luntz, the same Frank Luntz who wrote the confidential 2009 Hasbara manual that I covered in detail in my last video. As shown by his comprehensive polling, audiences respond to claims of quote-unquote Hamas rape and massacre more than anything else. This while Israeli soldiers clearly showcase not only their genocidal intent, but also their intent to commit rape in Gaza.
بس لا هو طرفة هيك خملها زي هيك القد حديد لما تفتحها زي هيك ويحط لك اياها جوا بخلي مخك يطلع.
Internationally, I'm getting the sense that the Israeli atrocity narrative is falling apart. The damage it has inflicted, however, both on the struggle against sexual violence writ large, with its overshadowing of actual verifiable cases against Palestinian women and men by the IDF, and by giving the West a reason to greenlight the genocide, cannot be overstated. In 2020, during the George Floyd uprising, I remember watching a conversation with Idris Robinson and Shimon Salam, where Shimon observed the useful distinction between those who centered Black suffering and those who centered Black agency. I've been holding that in mind since October 7. It would have been very easy to focus the majority of this video about the horrors Israel is and has been inflicting upon Palestinians. The question is, at what point does this focus become disempowering rather than mobilizing? At what point does indignation and anger turn into despair? What is the threshold for you? Think about yourself, the person watching this. Maybe you're watching it alone, maybe you're with a friend. What moves you? Seeing people pushing back brings me out of the paralyzing horror. It challenges me to have a fraction of their courage. And people have been pushing back. Broadly, here is how asymmetric warfare has looked since Vietnam onwards. When the invader bombs from the outside, the insurgent goes underground, literally, physically into bunkers and tunnels underground to wait out the bombing. To win, the attacker has to enter, but when that happens, the defender emerges to attack. You'll see this in military manuals too. There's this American, this former colonel, head of the urban warfare program at West Point. His name is John Spencer, and him. He's a genocidal psychopath, but he wrote a short book called The Mini Manual for the Urban Defender, which is based on US Army battle experience in the Middle East. Basically, a few months into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, he decided to reveal to the world what has worked against American invasions. It's quite short, less than 100 pages, and it outlines with detailed diagrams what common civilians can do to fight back against a foreign invasion. It was translated into multiple languages, Ukrainian and Arabic too. The Ukrainian government printed 100,000 copies and distributed it on the front lines. And it says, if you haven't started digging, start digging. Wait until the bombing ends, emerge, when the invasion comes and lure the invader into your traps. Facing possibly the most intricate systems of tunnels ever created in history, it seems like Israel fell into a strategic trap by starting a ground invasion in the first place. Accordingly, almost every day since the ground invasion started, the Palestinian resistance has put out unbelievable videos of guerrilla footage targeting the IDF with snipers, mines, IEDs, mortars, thermobaric explosives, which hold a flammable combo of magnesium and mercury that burns in closed spaces in 3,000 degrees, and countless RPG strikes, frequently with the Yassin 105, which is a made-in-Gaza double-headed munition that disables the tank's reactive armor. John Elmer's Twitter profile is currently a good archive of this footage. In this Qassam Brigade's video, Qassam is the armed wing of Hamas, you can see a fighter emerging out of a tunnel to see 3 tanks, attaching an explosive device to the body of the tank, returning to the tunnel to get an RPG from his comrade, and firing it one more time on the tank. Then he examines the remains of the tank in the aftermath. Imagine charging a tank column to hand deliver an explosive. And while he's doing it, he's reciting this Quranic verse about putting a barrier in front and behind them so that they can't see. When I first watched this video, I thought it was surely the single bravest action I've ever seen on tape, but then they just kept coming. Every other day. A similar operation, again, here, a militant is placing a heavy Shawad explosive on the tank and getting away. Here you can see what appears to be a periscope surveilling Israeli soldiers in an encampment within the Gaza Strip, coming out of a tunnel inside the camp itself. This is how close they're getting to the Israeli soldiers. Here is a burning Namer, which is an armed personnel carrier, APC, and the guy posing next to the burning Namer. Here we can see the tactical maneuvers across and through the rubble to target more tanks and APCs. This has reminded a lot of people of the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II, when the Germans bombed the city so bad that their tanks couldn't drive effectively through the rubble, and Chuikov instructed his troops to, quote, hug the enemy, which meant staying as close as possible to their positions to keep safely out of shelling distance and attacking with relative ease from piles of rubble and concrete that turn effectively into what army experts call the ideal bunker. Here is captured IDF equipment. Here are captured identification tags of Israeli soldiers. I could do a whole hour-long video just reacting to the endless stream of unbelievable footage. The Israeli casualty rate has risen accordingly, with the army releasing the names of 2 to 5 dead soldiers a day on average during the first 2 months of the ground invasion, as well as dozens of wounded soldiers every day. And these are just their figures, knowing the Israeli army is a pathological liar. According to Israeli hospital registrations, the actual number of wounded soldiers is about 10 times higher than what the IDF has been releasing, with thousands of newly disabled soldiers in what an Israeli Defense Ministry official says is, quote, unprecedented, not something we've ever dealt with. Citizens report a consistent flow of rescue helicopters from Gaza to the hospitals. Israel hasn't released the names of the soldiers on these dog tags, which makes me think that when the resistance says the number of casualties is much, much higher, they're not mistaken. Though again, this is not confirmed. But it demonstrates what many military analysts have been saying for months. Israel might have total air superiority, it might be funded by the richest country in the world, and it might even have obtained the international legitimacy to conduct a genocide, but in an urban terrain as complex and dense as Gaza, it doesn't hold the military advantage. In a vein that goes back to Clausewitz, and that has been reuttered by army scholars with names that are like made up, such as John Robb and John Spencer, the defender has the advantage. The invader needs a ratio of at least 10 to 1, and some even say 20 to 1, in order to win in urban warfare, and Israel doesn't even have half of that. It was initially able to recruit 300 to 350,000 reserve soldiers, but this has shut down multiple economic sectors. It can't keep so many citizens out of their jobs for months at a time, and it's been gradually letting them go, leaving only several tens of thousands of soldiers for each of the three fronts it needs to fight. In the north, against Hezbollah, that has an estimated 100,000 soldiers, in the West Bank, against increasingly volatile popular resistance, and in Gaza, where Hamas alone has, as of October 7, an estimated 40,000 fighters, not to mention other resistance groups like PIJ with 10,000. Purely numerically, this Israeli operation has been doomed from the start. Early on in the ground invasion, Israel's approach has been described as a herd of elephants, meaning that it's been moving slowly and destructively into Gaza with heavy machinery, tanks, APCs, bulldozers, a slow-moving herd trampling, blowing up, and destroying what's in front of it. And this slow, destructive motion has been countered by a spider web, meaning a deeply intricate network of tunnels that acts as a trap for the enemy. I'm actually taking this term from Yocheved Lifshitz, a fierce 85-year-old woman who was one of the first hostages or prisoners to be released and who essentially spoke up in order to promote a prisoner exchange.
Huge network of tunnels underneath. It looks like a spider web.
In a failure of Israeli media manipulation, she was allowed to speak, and she did speak openly, saying she was treated very kindly by her captors, that they were extremely prepared for a long war, and that she was led through a very intricate network of tunnels, like spider webs. And I know that over decades, the resistance has been calling the Israeli army a spider web 2 with a different idea in mind, because a spider web is supposedly weak and the army's defenses collapsed so easily in the push of October 7. But as Deleuze says in his postscript on the societies of control, the coils of a serpent are even more complex than the burrows of a molehill, and a network of spider webs capable of rejuvenating itself rapidly, of multiplying, and of entrapping its prey is more resilient than a blind surge forward to nowhere. As the martyred Palestinian resistance fighter Basil al-Araj wrote in his 8 points on a ground invasion, the Palestinian resistance consists of guerrilla formations whose strategies follow the logic of guerrilla warfare or hybrid warfare. War is never based on the logic of conventional wars and the defense of fixed points and borders. On the contrary, you draw the enemy into an ambush. You do not stick to a fixed position to defend it. Instead, you perform maneuvers, movement, withdrawal, and attack from the flanks and the rear. The resistance isn't trying to hold space. The IDF advances, destroying as much as possible, but everywhere it stops and becomes static, it gets hit by fighters coming out of tunnels or out of the rubble. Or, as we've still seen 5 months into the uprising, hitting them with cheap commercial drones from above. In what is truly kind of the inversion of the colonial gaze, right? We remember the thermal footage of Stop Cop City protesters disarming really the Cop City construction site. Now we're seeing Palestinian resistance fighters dismantling Israeli military infrastructure. Think about the panopticon, this carceral structure from which a prison guard would be able to see into the cells of all prisoners without being seen, such that it regulates prisoner behavior without actually needing to surveil them. The power of the panopticon collapses the moment that the prisoners understand that the guard can't surveil all of them at once all the time, and that surveillance itself is only threatening to them inasmuch as the guard is capable of acting upon what he sees. On October 7, the resistance collapsed Israel's panoptic power, but what is revealed through the ground invasion is that Israel's panopticism was itself a trap. Think of the structure of the panopticon, where, behind the prison cells, there is an intricate network of tunnels that allows the prisoners to plot, scheme, meet their needs, while creating a mirage that they're under panoptic control. The guard's panoptic power itself becomes a vulnerability. He thinks he sees everything, but behind every cell, there's a tunnel. After the resistance struck Israel, the IDF entered to discover that the terrain has been transformed without its knowledge and past its wildest imagination. There is another Gaza, underground, with most of it still out of reach. The tunnels become a line of flight, the ground operation a long, messy, deadly attempt at re-territorialization. In this video essay, an increasingly theoretical screed. On October 7, the Palestinian resistance defeated Israel on the level of strategy. Since then, Israel has been reacting suicidally from a place of strategic vacuum. The Hannibal Directive, Israel's preference of killing its captured soldiers and citizens, is leading into the Hannibal era, Israel's suicidal way forward within the vacuum. Another way to think of it is the biblical logic of Tamut nafshi im plishtim, Samson's suicide when he brought the building on himself and his captors. But there are more or less informed strategic visions that are vying to fill the void. In this section, I will survey Israel's strategic situation, examining its military theory historically, from the present moment backward. Sun Tzu's Art of War is a truly brilliant text, so concise and so relevant thousands of years after its writing. In the section Attack by Stratagem, Sun Tzu emphasizes that the first order of warfare is to attack the enemy's strategy, his plans, what he wants to do. The next priority is to attack his alliances, then his logistics, or the junction of the enemy's forces, then the army in the field, or his foot soldiers, and finally, the worst policy of all is to besiege walled cities. If you attack by stratagem, you could crush the enemy's will to fight without injury to your forces. The tricky part of this is to identify what your enemy's strategy is, and to devise and define your own strategy. If you know your enemy and know yourself, Sun Tzu says, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Israel's strategy under Netanyahu's lengthy administration has been defined by a lack of initiative, a commitment to maintaining, as much as possible, what Tarek Bakoni calls a violent equilibrium. Footnote, and by the way, Tarek Bakoni is excellent, and his book, Hamas Contained, is a must to everyone who wants to understand this organization. It's a critical look at Hamas. It doesn't glorify it in any way, but it also dispels a lot of the myths and disinformation about it, and it's not afraid to look at Hamas honestly for what it is, and no matter which side you're on, whether you're anti-genocide or pro-genocide, you need to recognize reality in order to achieve your goals. And maybe I shouldn't tell you that, actually. So if you're a Zionist, maybe don't. Netanyahu became the figurehead of the doctrine of Nihul HaKonflikt, the indefinite management of the conflict, the continuation of the apartheid regime on a back-burner, low-flame conflict. Even though it was arguably first introduced by Moshe Dayan, the guy with the eye, or actually without it, Netanyahu solidified this approach by literally trolling the so-called peace negotiations since the 90s. This strategic disposition already takes shape in his book A Durable Peace, which, like a famously genocidal leader who wrote only one book, is premised around the construction of a zero-sum game between the forces of good and evil, in this case, the ahistoric idea that Palestinians, he only talks about them with scare quotes, are a phantom nation that is nothing but a tool in the eternal war between Islam and the West. The same logic, in turn, informed IDF strategy documents over the past 2 decades, culminating in Gadi Eisenkot's 2015 and 2018 Estrategiat Tzahal, the IDF strategy, which details the IDF's broad view operational framework. Eisenkot, who pioneered the Dahiya doctrine in the 2006 Lebanon War, which prioritizes disproportionate use of force and the targeting of civilian infrastructure, and who was head of the IDF between 2015 and 2019, and who is now a minister and observing member of Israel's war cabinet, and who has lost his son and a nephew in the battle in Gaza. Eisenkot is one of the few IDF chiefs of staff in recent memory to have studied in the US Army War College, and you can see this influence in the IDF strategy document. Like the US Army's counterinsurgency or COIN Field Manual FM 3-24, which I quoted at length in my previous video and will talk about in detail here, this document too stresses the importance of legitimacy, publicly and internally, for all military operations. But unlike it doesn't see counterinsurgency as important or central to military activity. Counterinsurgency, as Dylan Rodriguez emphasizes, implies a, quote, full spectrum of pacification, isolation, and domestication strategies that extend beyond violent state repression. COIN aspires for a totality that is realized through broader non-military policy, but that must be reflected in Army doctrine. Achieving this totality might actually mean being circumspect and strategic about the use of force. But this official IDF document isn't geared at the totality of COIN, but at the continuation of the violent equilibrium of the status quo without putting an end to insurgencies by either co-opting or eliminating them, or by addressing the grievances that made them necessary in the first place. But shh, don't talk about the core issue. The status quo is essentially understood in this document by the acronym MABAM in Hebrew, Hamaracha Sheben Hamilchamot, or the operation between wars. The MABAM became the only strategic innovation in Israeli doctrine following the 2006 war. Rather than allowing the irregular or sub-state enemy, Tat Medinatiyim in Hebrew, to build power unimpeded, as with Hezbollah after Israel's withdrawal from South Lebanon in 2000, Israel would now hold small-scale tactical attacks against weapon supplies and key personnel, or in their words, covert and clandestine operations, for the purpose of damaging the enemy's efforts and initiative. These are essentially conspiratorial and manipulative operations that are meant to conceal the identity of the actor, or even the operation itself. The wording here is just another small indicator that Israel, in all echelons, is just completely disinterested in the legality of its activity. We know this is true for US forces as well, but at least they do a better job at hiding their criminal or extra-legal intentions in their official documents. The wars in this operation between wars framework are quick, short, scorched earth operations that are limited in time according to the level of international legitimacy awarded for the operation. This is known as the logic of mowing the lawn or mowing the grass, basically cracking down on the adversary's military capabilities and preventing or, quote, minimizing the enemy's empowerment. Nominally, Israeli reality in this view is determined by an everlasting low-scale war with occasional spurts of fire that are all geared at minimum disruption to the status quo, minimum loss to Israeli life, and maximum profits. Profits, again, come from these operations being tied to the economic cycle and to the ability to give a battle-tested stamp to Israel's most important industry, its weapons industry. In turn, this reliance on military technology signals another way in which IDF doctrine has been diverted from the counterinsurgency methods that had been so useful in pacifying the First Intifada through the co-optation of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and the formation of the Palestinian Authority, the PA.
Hereby once more declare that I condemn terrorism in all its forms.
And what does Intifada mean, you're asking? Well, let's listen to the nuanced take from Sinan Anton, one of the foremost Arabic translators and writers of the century.
Sinan, as a language expert, and you have been for, a few decades now, what is the meaning of the word Intifada?
Thank you, Bassam, for this opportunity at these really critical times. Actually, intifada means uprising.
That is a shocking revelation. Starting in December 1987, the first Intifada was a massive popular uprising against Israeli apartheid. This uprising saw the use of the tools of mass struggle to great effect: strikes, civil disobedience, mass rallies, riots, tax resistance, all working together in confluence. And despite the fact that the uprising was largely unarmed, it was met with unspeakable brutality, the killing of many hundreds of protesters, the arrests of tens of thousands, and injuries to over 100,000 Palestinians by Israeli soldiers who were specifically instructed by Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin to break their bones. Still, it's remembered with incredible fondness by that generation of rebels, and the way that this uprising was pacified was not by breaking their bones, but by bringing in the PLO, which was in exile in Tunis, and appointing it as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. As specified in the US Army's field manual, successful, long-lasting counterinsurgency, quote, requires development of viable local leaders and institutions, end quote. If there are no leaders, if the resistance is decentralized, CUN requires the creation of a centralized leadership. The PLO, which had been created by Arab states in 1964 as what Bakoni calls a tool to control the insurgent Palestinian factions, was now appointed by the US and Israel as the leadership of the uprising. This allowed Israel and the US to marginalize and ignore the decentralized popular committees that were, to use Fanon's terminology, guiding the insurrection away from recuperable traditional politics. Then, through the Oslo Accords between 1993 and 1995, the PLO, Israel, and the US formed the PA as an auxiliary arm of the Israeli occupation, with a limited security apparatus that would be dedicated to policing and repressing insurgents within Palestinian population clusters in select areas of the West Bank and Gaza. I can't describe how successful this move was. Well-meaning people still see the Oslo Accords as a genuine peace process rather than a sophisticated counterinsurgency operation that enabled Israel to continue entrenching its settlement project with relative calm. After the so-called peace process collapsed, with the conclusion of the 5 years allotted for its duration, the PA remained. The Second Intifada broke in October 2000, and for a brief moment PLO head Yasser Arafat did act up by releasing 350 political prisoners, including Hamas and PIJ members, but then the US and Israel basically fired him, and a new collaborator-in-chief was appointed, Mahmoud Abbas, aka Abu Mazen.
أنا ضد المقاومة. التنسيق الأمني مقدس. أنا علنا بحكي. أنا ضد المقاومة علنا. أنا بدي أتعاون مع الإسرائيليين. التنسيق الأمني مقدس.
The PA was ousted from Gaza in 2007 when Abu Mazen attempted what Bakoni calls a US-planned coup after Hamas won the elections in 2006. But Abu Mazen was able to complete the coup in the West Bank and greatly help in stabilizing Israel's control there. The PA creates the appearance of Palestinian autonomy, but in fact, much like the governments of the Bantustans of apartheid South Africa, it is simply an extension of the colonial state, a tool of counterinsurgency that is highly effective for the repression of local rebellions because it makes the native population police itself. Fatah, which was a revolutionary movement, the Palestinian resistance movement in the early days of the armed struggle, is now contained by the PA. Would-be rebels are now government employees, fighting to keep their jobs, right? Their collaborationist jobs. Community organizers are now working for NGOs, which are what Colin Powell calls force multipliers for empire. The money funneled by NATO countries into the nonprofit and government sector is the main reason for the relative pacification of the West Bank following the militarization of the Palestinian resistance in the Second Intifada. This echoes General Petraeus' counterinsurgency guideline of employing money as a weapon system. These are the winning coin principles. Move in with overwhelming force to control space, isolate the insurgents from the general population, appoint your own government, but importantly, make it of the same identity as the general population, and supply the population with services so they don't become insurgents to meet their basic needs. This ties with General Peter Chiarelli's SWET concept, standing for Sewage, Water, Electricity, and Trash Collection, and I recommend Greg Stoker's short video on SWET MSO for his own explainer of this. In short, divide and conquer and money. This is how empires win wars. But somehow, even though the world supplied the Palestinian Authority with the neoliberal institutions that would lead it into the choking counterinsurgent stability of a neocolonial regime, Israel keeps shooting itself in the foot. Interestingly, Israeli army literature generally fails to recognize the effectiveness of the PA in furthering its own interests. The term counterinsurgency hasn't been comprehensively translated into Hebrew, and when Israeli strategists do talk about it in English, they generally conflate COIN with counterterrorism and use it almost like clickbait because it's like a catchy term in military theory. You can see it scrolling through this Cambridge publication edited by Israeli authors. In this timeline of Israel's purported counterinsurgency experience, they simply skip the important years following the Oslo Accords, revealing to us that they only understand COIN as the application of force and not as stability operations, which is at the heart of COIN. How can they misunderstand this? It might have something to do with the nature of Israel being a settler colony, where the foundational idea is to ethnically cleanse and replace the native population rather than simply contain and control it. But I think the true reason is actually incompetence and, on a broader level, greed. The Israeli army, as argued by Israeli historian Uri Milstein, is a deeply anti-intellectual institution, and with its increased reliance on the army as a generator of GDP, it incentivizes a suicidal military strategy. I suppose you could see this as a symptom of capitalism as a whole, where the market inexorably continues its suicidal drive despite the grave consequences for the perpetuation of itself. The Palestinian resistance, which, by contrast, focuses on sumud, perseverance, and on the long-term sustainability of its capacity to fight, might find this somewhat encouraging. So how did Israel's faulty military doctrine turn into the mess that it is today? In the early aughts, Israel moved from the successful COIN of Oslo in the 90s to the techno-fetishism of a military paradigm best called RMA, which stands for Revolution in Military Affairs. RMA hypothesizes that military innovation is driven by technological development. This idea originates from Soviet military theory as the term MTR, standing for Military Technical Revolution, or Военно-техническая революция.
Babachka. Not babushka, babachka.
But the Pentagon official who stole the concept in 1986 didn't want to use a Russian term. Hence, RMA. Quick, someone tell H. Bomber Guy the US empire is doing a plagiarism. As a doctrine, RMA prioritizes technological superiority over basically everything else. So, when you hear about war by remote control, precision strikes, AI target generators, robotic soldiers, smart bombs, laser beams, miniaturizations, drone wars, AI surveillance, all those pricey gadgets, think RMA. Now, before counterposing RMA against counterinsurgency, just another quick note on terminology. Militaries tend to compulsively produce abbreviations, and there are a host of three-letter theories that derive out of RMA, including NCW, Network-Centric Warfare, ONA, Operational Net Assessment, EBO, Effects-Based Operations, and this Israeli version SOD, Systemic Operational Design. If you review the literature that I'm citing on this, you might encounter any of these terms. Just know that they mainly come from a similar tech-obsessed episteme. The Israeli version of this doctrine is interesting inasmuch as it has this weird French philosophy influence. Systemic Operational Design, SOD, was developed by the IDF's Shimon Nave, also known as Foucault on steroids. You might have heard about Nave as the guy from the documentary The Lab, who said,
טוב, כמו שאתם רואים, זה לא כפר ערבי. זה מקום מת. אולי בחלום הוורוד, ככה היו רוצים שכפרים ערביים ייראו, פלסטינים ייראו, אבל זה לא כפר ערבי.
Well, not exactly what I had in mind, but also, Navet took credit for the idea of IDF soldiers as moving through walls, and infatuated with post-structuralist French philosophy, tried to apply a kind of incoherent Deleuzian framework on IDF strategy as a whole. Of course, as you can see in the Palestinian videos coming out of Gaza since the ground invasion started, it is the insurgent who actually moves through walls, the insurgent who is agile, the insurgency that is fractal-like and decentralized, and this idea from the get-go shows army strategists' tendency to want to be like the insurgent, as noted by Abdel Jawad Omar. Counterinsurgency, COIN, on the other hand, is much more holistic in its understanding of how wars work, how they are won, how armies and states actually achieve their goals. Counterinsurgency as a military doctrine is considered to have originated from the French experience in Algeria with the works of David Galula, or David Galula, a Tunisian Jew who collaborated with French colonialism as an army officer in Algeria in the 1950s and who is seen as the father of contemporary counterinsurgency. And as a figure, he is interesting to me personally as a kind of counter to Fanon, as military and theoretical enemies, like decolonialism versus counterinsurgency. But I'll get into that some other time. Anyway, counterinsurgency really rose into prominence only in the 2000s with General David Petraeus, who steered the writing of the US Army's Counterinsurgency Field Manual, FM 324, in collaboration with David Kilcullen and others. Why are all the counterinsurgency bros called David? Like, it makes no sense. FM 324 was informed by the shit show in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's become a kind of weird Bible for counterinsurgency and is even cited by Israeli strategists in their own version of counterinsurgency, which I have and will also discuss. Originally, I would trace counterinsurgency back to early colonialism or even earlier days of divide and conquer, and to what is possibly the earliest counterinsurgency or anti-guerrilla manual, the 1599 Milicia Indiana, the Indian militia, by the somewhat ridiculous Spanish conquistador Bernardo de Vargas Machuca, who recommends using friendly Indians for colonial conquest. In the book The Insurgents, David Petraeus and the Plot to Change the American Way of War, Fred Kaplan traces a rivalry between RMA and COIN in American warfare. Footnote: if you're a true military theory nerd, you could trace this to the Clausewitz versus Jomini divide, where Clausewitz was much more contextual and subtle with his teachings, and the Jominian line was more like, you win by annihilating the enemy. Kind of give the dumb soldier what he wants and then misattribute the line to Clausewitz vibes. Essentially, the arms race with the Soviet Union pushed an emphasis on technological advancement that deprioritized human contact, ground troops, and cultural strategic thinking. But then, with the prevalence of asymmetric conflicts, the recurring failures of the US Army first in Vietnam and then in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the collapse of the Iron Wall in 1989, COIN started gradually rising as a dominant doctrine, culminating with the publication of the first edition of FM 3-24 in 2006. COIN requires a deep understanding of the enemy's culture to be effective, so it's epistemically rooted in the social sciences and in history. You can think of this division disciplinarily too in military academies. RMA is like STEM, and COIN is like social sciences and humanities. Petraeus came out of the social sciences department at West Point. Footnote: in this framing it makes sense that COIN has become absent from Israeli strategy, because Israel has been gradually gutting humanities programs. But I suppose the same thing has been happening everywhere. As mentioned, FM 3-24 has become a kind of Bible for counterinsurgents. It's even cited by the few Israeli strategists who became aware of the term. One example is Israeli General Yaakov Amidror. Now let's be clear. This senior IDF strategist is a total RMA wonk. He cut his teeth as a strategist by writing about EOB and he came out of October 7 with a document concluding that Israel needs to, quote, expand investive in innovative technology. But for some reason, he wrote a 2010 English article poorly entitled Winning Counterinsurgency War, The Israeli Experience. I suppose coin was a fashionable term, and he wanted to promote the myth that the IDF and he himself are all cutting edge, but in citing the basic coin texts and trying to apply them to Israeli army history, he shows the reading comprehension of a preschooler. Actually, that might be offensive to preschoolers. Y'all are lit.
When I get up out of town and go to bed, I will be glad to go home and enjoy the rest of my life.
Here, General Yaakov conflates Israel's counterterrorism tactical operations against the Palestinian resistance with COIN as a whole. He simply doesn't consider stability operations as a thing, which reflects Israeli doctrine at large. But he cites FM 3-24, and he too, at least in his English writing, stresses, quote, separating the civilian population from the terrorist entities, saying there is a vital need in counterinsurgency operations to drive a wedge between the civilian population that has nothing to do with terrorism and the terrorist entities against which a military campaign must be conducted, end quote. This stands out to me in his writing because it is accurate to the spirit of COIN. But what goes unsaid is that the state gets to define what terrorism means, be it a boycott, which Israel calls economic terrorism, or an appeal to international law for intervention, which is diplomatic terrorism. At the end of the day, this vagueness demonstrates what Israel refuses to understand about COIN, which is that at the heart of COIN is the entrenchment or incitement of division and the appointment of leaders who will push for the state's interests. If you can't separate the insurgents from the general population, if you can't appoint a collaborator from the populace to do your bidding, you might very well find yourself suicidally entrenched in RMA. RMA has gone well with the no-partner framework, a phrase credited to Israeli PM Ehud Barak with the collapse of the Camp David negotiations in the year 2000 and enacted by all succeeding prime ministers. As stated, regardless of long-term results, individual leaders have financial incentives in promoting this military doctrine, cutting arms deals, and bumping GDP with every large-scale army operation. So RMA has been the mode of Israeli warfare since the early 2000s, and honestly, 7 months into the current escalation, I see no indication that it's been at all abandoned. But this all backfired heavily on October 7th. Going back to Sun Tzu, cited at the beginning of this section, the Palestinian resistance was able to attack Israel on the level of strategy, collapsing Netanyahu's strategy of Nihul HaSichsuch, the management of the conflict, defeating the idea that technological advantage, smart fences, remote robotic sentries, and surveillance could protect Israel, fracturing the social contract between Israeli citizens and the state, i.e. that Israelis would serve in the army, pay taxes, populate the colonized space by living in strategic locations, etc., in return for protection and prosperity. To sum up, in case you watch videos like me while washing dishes and watering plants, getting distracted by the poor state of your Tradescantia, following October 7th, Israel has been in what I would call a strategic vacuum, reacting out of genocidal rage and humiliation, and continuously shattering to dust its own social contract by bombing, shooting, and even gassing its own citizens held hostage in Gaza. With the collapse of this paradigm, different strategic approaches are vying to fill the void, namely COIN, which is pushed by the primary genocidal accomplice, the US, and full-fledged messianic genocide, which is very popular in the extremely fascistic and racist Israeli society. The COIN vision would basically see a revamped Palestinian Authority try to take control of the Gaza Strip in some kind of process towards statehood. But the problem is that any Israeli leader who would outspokenly agree to roll with this scenario is unlikely to win among Israeli voters who have been conditioned for years to see Arabs as subhuman terrorists who could never be trusted with the state. It's important to emphasize that even though COIN is more sophisticated about achieving its goals, it does not necessarily imply any less brutality. I went on the It's Going Down podcast a couple of months ago and talked to Tom Nomad about all this, and he suggested that genocide can sometimes create what he calls a blank slate, by physically wiping out the insurgency, albeit with devastating costs to the culprit in the long term. Since the beginning of the genocide, a lot of the key figures of contemporary counterinsurgency, including Petraeus himself, have reiterated fabricated Israeli atrocity propaganda to claim that Hamas has to be destroyed, tacitly accepting the fact that without the ability to separate Hamas from the Gazan population, this would necessarily mean the genocide of Gaza. The difference between this approach and a religious commandment for genocide echoed by key figures in Israeli government, including, by the way, Netanyahu himself with the infamous Amalek statement, is that it is genocide cloaked with legitimacy. It hides the intent of genocide and might more successfully enact it while escaping the consequences of total loss of public legitimacy. Again, as I argued in a former video, military action and narrative, and essentially coin as a whole, lean on legitimacy. At the time of this production, the Palestinian wildcard remains hostages. Taking soldiers hostage has been a way for the Palestinian resistance to generate leverage against Israel for decades. The first deal that broke the status quo of one-to-one prisoner for prisoner was, according to Israeli negotiator Ariel Merari, a 1978 agreement with the PFLP General Command, a militant group that splintered from the PFLP, to exchange 76 Palestinian prisoners for one Israeli soldier. Since then, the resistance was able to raise the floor of Israeli negotiations with every deal, with the Jibril Agreement being particularly contentious in the Israeli national memory, where the PFLP-GC was able, in exchange for 3 Israeli soldiers captured during the First Lebanon War, to bargain for the release of 1,151 Palestinian political prisoners, including the Palestine Solidarity militant Kozo Okamoto of the Japanese Red Army. Gilad Shalit, kidnapped in 2006, marked another watershed deal. Shalit was captured and 2 other soldiers in the tank were killed during Olmert's government, an Israeli prime minister who, in an Al Jazeera documentary interviewing him, expressed disrespect for Shalit himself for not fighting back like the others who were killed, basically revealing that Israeli leaders prefer soldiers dead rather than captured.
החייל השלישי, גלעד שליט, בפועל בעצם נכנע ללא קרב.
Shalit's family, with his dad Noam in the forefront, was able to galvanize the social movement to pressure for his release through a no-matter-the-cost prisoner exchange. This social movement was picked up and endorsed by Olmert's rivals across Zionist political lines, from the right-wing to liberal Zionists. Olmert was still going to broker a deal of about 350 Palestinian prisoners for Shalit, but according to him in this AJ interview, his rival and former PM Ehud Barak visited Shalit's family a night before the deal would be signed, signaling to Hamas that Israel would bend further yet. When Netanyahu took power in 2009, with Ehud Barak as Minister of Defense, it was with a promise to his base to bring Gilad Shalit home. And in 2011, an unbelievable deal was brokered, 1,027 Palestinians for one soldier, including head of Hamas in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar. This agreement is largely seen by both sides as a huge failure for Israel and an amazing victory for the resistance. David Graeber, in his piece on Palestine after his visit, had one of his quintessentially simple yet profound anthropological observations where he said that hospitality is the entire point of life in Palestinian culture, and that one of the tragic ironies is that Israel is the worst possible guest. And it's true, Anyone who's experienced Palestinian hospitality will tell you that. In many ways, the meaning, the core of social life in Palestine is to be generous to guests and strangers. We've seen this with the incredible patience Palestinians had with Zionists since the early years of colonization. And we're seeing it in the treatment of the hostages and how they recounted their experiences in the rare occasions that they were actually allowed to speak freely before Israeli spokespeople intervened, as was the case with Yocheved Lifshitz. We've also seen this with Gilad Shalit. He has never spoken in detail, apparently not even to his family, about his 5-year experience in captivity. But Hamas released footage of him basically hanging out with his captors, Hamas's shadow unit, chatting, drinking a ton of tea, receiving letters from his family, doing a barbecue outside, and so on. Now, I'm sure it wasn't a pleasant situation for him, but compare that with the experience of Palestinian prisoners who, since October 7, have been experiencing retributive torture, beatings, being put in stress postures, sleep deprivation by blasting Israel's national anthem in the cell, and murder, as with the case of the Palestinian Foucault, the theorist, the writer, the resistance fighter, the martyr now, Walid Daqa. And in international media, we see this absolutely racist double standard. No word about more than 7,500 Palestinian political prisoners held without fair trial, many of whom don't even know what the justifications are for capturing them under administrative detention, not to mention thousands more who were abducted since October 7. Up until now, every deal has set the new floor in Israel's hostage negotiations with the resistance. The question going forward is whether the Shalit deal and October 7 created enough of a rift in Israel's sense of self that this will now change, and that Israel will be able to withstand the pressure to concede. The cost of not conceding might be too high, paving the way for mass migration. Eschewing a prediction that might be proven wrong, I would say we might want to wait for the 5-year mark before making any conclusions one way or the other. Historically, Israel takes 5 years to concede after a military defeat, and it is only force and violence that forces its hand. 5 years after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, it finally made a commitment to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. 5 years after the beginning of the First Intifada, it allowed tens of thousands of Palestinian refugees, including Yasser Arafat, to return to Palestine and start the so-called peace process. 5 years after the start of the Second Intifada, it withdrew its settlements from Gaza. And 5 years after Gilad Shalit was captured, his release deal was finally brokered in 2011. The true gains from the current leverage that Palestinians hold with their hostages from October 7 will only materialize as Israel's shaky political terrain crumbles internally under the Netanyahu administration. As with Netanyahu against Olmert, the opposition parties, headed by the genocidal Zionist centrist Yair Lapid, are claiming to be the rescuers of the hostages now. Sooner or later, they might find themselves brokering Israel's concession. Many of us like to ask ourselves, what would I do if I was alive during slavery, or the Jim Crow South, or apartheid? What would I do if my country was committing genocide? The answer is, you're doing it. Right now. The question remains, when will the world intervene? The resistance within Gaza continues unabated to inflict IDF casualties and impede the machinery of genocide. We've seen this with the complex ambushes that have driven the IDF out of areas in Gaza. Resistance continues also, importantly, in Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. In the US, there has been some targeting of Israeli shipping company Zim, of arms manufacturer Elbit, and other logistical operations and weapons manufacturers. At the time that I'm filming this, college campuses in the US are becoming a new field of resistance. However, resistance here in the Imperial Center, in the financial and military source of this genocide, has not yet turned into the generalized unrest that might conceivably help stopping the genocide. Liberals and identity politicians, as well as anti-Zionist Arab, Jewish, and student organizations, some of whom have expressly denounced October 7, have been able to channel popular rage towards marches and rallies, and are now gearing up to continue this de facto counterinsurgency operation by platforming electoral campaigns and negotiating the eviction of remaining encampments. However, their dominion over Palestine solidarity protesting on this continent is being contested. The insurrectionary tendencies that participated in the 2020 George Floyd uprising and that have apparently reappeared in the Stop Cop City movement, notably with a successful attack on the Cop City construction site on March 5, 2023, have seemingly started intervening for Palestine. This informal, completely decentralized network was apparently able to pressure at least one major Cop City subcontractor, Atlas Technical Consultants, to drop the construction project after dozens of clandestine sabotage attacks all over the country.
Atlas is no longer involved in whatever you guys...
Why did they decide to get out of it?
Because you guys are fucking nightmares and you broke all our fucking windows. So thank you.
A similar campaign could conceivably isolate, drive out, or compel local arms manufacturers to stop supplying Israel. Whether the mass proletarian elements who made the 2020 George Floyd uprising possible will participate still remains to be seen. We've seen hints of that in LA and in other places to an extent, but we're not yet seeing the generalized unrest that might be necessary.
I think we're just causing enough chaos to get attention. You want this shit going countrywide. You want the person with no sense to their name to have enough word in this world to change it.
In February, anarchist Aaron Bushnell did the extraordinary act of killing a US Air Force soldier by committing a live-streamed self-immolation, an act of solidarity felt deeply by various Palestinian resistance groups. While his death is tragic and horrifying, it charged what he had to say with meaning. This seemed to have helped in giving protest in the US another bump, challenging people here and everywhere again to have a fraction of his courage and do everything in their power to stop the genocide. The 2016 book Blessed is the Flame by Serafinsky surveys concentration camp resistance during the Holocaust. It chronicles militant actions by Jews against the Nazis, regardless of the ultimate utility of the acts. So it'll say, for example, on September 11, 1942, after watching his wife and child be selected for the gas chambers in Treblinka, Meir Berliner attacked an SS man with a knife, stabbing him to death and leaving the knife protruding from his back. Berliner and over 100 of his fellow inmates were cruelly killed. The author will say this without any moral judgment about the utility or value of the act. It'll chronicle the rebellions at Sobibor or Warsaw without celebrating the fact that the fighters leading these rebellions had a higher percentage of survival than the Jews who acquiesced to German orders. I think that this is a tremendous book in how it interweaves history with theory, arguing that these often desperate acts of resistance are worth chronicling for the mere fact of their existence, that in an act of resistance, there is jouissance, this joy suffused with a death drive, and that this joy, this dark joy of rebellion, is, in fact, the meaning of life. Serafinsky is self-consciously contradictory and inconsistent about the idea of meaning or purpose, but to me, that doesn't necessarily weaken the argument that there is still a something worth fighting for in the nothing of our existence. Basil al-Araj, in his essay لماذا نذهب إلى الحرب, Why We Go to War, arrives at a similar answer, which he, maybe somewhat awkwardly, calls a romancia, or romanticism. But this brings me to what he calls the continuous value of resistance over time, or al-muqawamat jadwa mustamirra, meaning that the fruit of resistance and of fighting back does materialize eventually. I started this video stating that the uprising will put Palestinians on a certain trajectory that, in historic terms, is more hopeful than the slow suffocation of the creeping genocide they had been enduring. It's something I feel myself obligated to hang on to within the horror. An important lesson from the Gaza Ghetto uprising is in the vulnerability of the state itself. As COIN aspires for total control, sudden disruption at multiple points at the same time can stretch its capacities to the point of collapse. It is much easier to control one protest of 1,000 people than 10 protests of 100 people. Surveillance, crowd control, policing at large becomes futile the more resistance there is. Israel has been collecting so much intelligence so broadly that it far exceeded its own processing capacities. Israel, as Tom Nomad said about the NSA, took a larger bite than it could chew. Panopticism revealed itself as a trap. Similarly, protesters might notice increased police surveillance in their cities, but remember that policing relies on the perception of force, on the police's ability to project capacity through space in order to deter you. So not on actual capacity, but the perception of it, right? If enough of you remain undeterred, you will stretch the police's actual capacities to the point of collapse, as we've seen happen during the George Floyd uprising. Counterinsurgency can only succeed if you become absorbed into it. Dismantling the cop in the head is not a metaphor. At the heart of COIN is the logic of divide and conquer. Control space, divide the population, isolate the insurgents, exploit existing identity separations or generate new ones so as to promote elites that would support the COIN objective. There is an ongoing exchange between army and police, and this same logic is applied domestically for policing strategy.
Where's your fucking badge, you pigs? We go hard for Palestine. We escalate for Palestine. We fight for Palestine. We give it everything we got. We do not work with the police. We do not point people out to the police. We do not lay hands on our comrades. When we go hard for our people, you stand out the way. If you ain't with it, stand out the way.
COIN is applied in the state's attempt to manage all social life, from disaster and pandemic response through to protest movements and gang politics. But by paying attention, by understanding military theory, the resistance at large can outmaneuver COIN. The case in point for activists and resistance movements is to always refuse both collaboration with the material arms of the state, such as police, the courts, and also university administrations, and to refuse to resign themselves to the more abstract but not less effective logic of COIN, be it about tactics, violence or nonviolence, legal or not, or identity. If you notice a group gravitating towards electoral campaigns, if it's controlled by NGO staff, if it's trying to run political candidates, if it tries to negotiate with the administration for scraps, remember that those systems are put in place for counterinsurgency purposes. Popular energy that can put a physical wrench in the wheels of destruction dissipates in bureaucratic processes, be they electoral or financial. Divestment, for example. Notice the groups that are saying, we're here to stop the genocide by all means necessary, we're here to fight until the US stops supplying arms to Israel, and the groups that are negotiating with university administrations for divestment. Divestment is unlikely to work at all if decision-making stays at the hands of university administrators. We've seen how the fossil fuel divestment, which seemed to have been successful in that pretty much all major universities divested. I was part of like a successful fossil fuel divestment campaign, but fossil fuel divestment did absolutely nothing to the fossil fuel industry because universities capitalized on the sharp turnaround among student bodies to reinvest in the very same industries through shell companies and other methods. Don't fall for this. Your first concession will be your last. The Palestinian resistance developed the concept of wahdat al-sahat, the unity of the fields, or the unity of the arenas, to prevent this kind of behavior and outmaneuver counterinsurgency. The unity of the fields allows different resistance groups kept apart by the spatial separation imposed upon them to coordinate in a decentralized fashion without developing a bureaucracy, but via signals that indicate the appropriate level of escalation. Resistance News Network, RNN, put out an editorial statement calling for Gaza solidarity encampments to adopt the unity of the fields and to think of themselves as part of a new arena of resistance, a new field that was created where encampments can, again, coordinate through one superstructure guided by principles of resistance and signals rather than by bureaucracy. Another way to think of this coordination is to think of memes and how they replicate. The first encampment at Columbia University had memetic force that projected itself across the globe. Similarly, the building occupation at Cal Poly Humboldt in California became a meme. with Colombia soon responding to the signal with their own building occupation. And this framework, different encampments can remain in solidarity with each other and in solidarity with the Palestinian resistance, escalating in tandem when necessary and refusing to become part of the counterinsurgency through toothless negotiation. If you notice that identity politics are used to dismiss riskier action, if you notice organizers shutting down proposals for escalation by saying it would pose a risk to people of a marginalized identity, point out the ID psyops. Point out that there's a larger risk of not acting, of allowing the people of Gaza to be genocided. Bassel El-Araj articulated his own reverse coin technology against the narrative machinations of counterinsurgency in the Palestinian context. Himself a martyred resistance fighter killed by Israeli soldiers in a shootout in 2017, Bassel was heavily influenced by Fanon and adopted his radically inclusive anti-identity politics outlook. In his 8 Rules and Insights on the Nature of War, Bassel said, "Every Palestinian, in the broad sense, meaning anyone who sees Palestine as a part of their struggle, regardless of their secondary identities, every Palestinian is on the front lines of the battle for Palestine, so be careful not to fail in your duty." This is very reminiscent of Fanon's understanding of Algerian as an inclusive revolutionary subjectivity, one that is available to anyone who chooses to participate in the liberation struggle, where friends and enemies are determined by what they do, not by who they are in terms of colonial constructions of race and identity. In this framing, Palestinian is not a racial or ethnic category, but a counter-identity available to anyone who participates in the struggle. And I'm just going to say that for me, reading this line was kind of life-transforming in a way. And it's not that I walk around saying, I'm Palestinian or whatever, right? That wouldn't slide in today's identity political discursive terrain. So I'm not saying I'm Palestinian, but it's transformative internally. It's a way for me to assess within myself on which side of history I'm on, right? And it allows me to be part of a liberation camp rather than part of an identity that was prescribed to me by a state that tries and hopefully fails to monopolize Judaism, So I grew up in the entity, of course, but I don't have to remain within it. I can cross the line, and so can you, wherever you are watching this, whether you're right over there in that entity or here in the US in this entity. You too can cross the line and join the resistance. In a lesser-known piece that has yet to fully appear in English, Bassel wrote, "I no longer see this as a conflict between Arabs and Jews, between Israeli and Palestinian. I have abandoned this duality, this naive oversimplification of the conflict. I have become convinced of Ali Shariati and Frantz Fanon's divisions of the world into a colonial camp and a liberation camp. In each of the two camps, you will find people of all religions, languages, races, ethnicities, colors, and classes. In this conflict, for example, you will find people of our own skin color standing rudely in the other camp, and at the same time, you will find Jews standing in our camp. If, as per Bassel and Fanon, the broad resistance would be able to distinguish friends and enemies based on the choices they make, on their actions and commitments, rather than their identity and race, then counterinsurgent psychological operations that pit people against each other and diffuse collective action might be halted at the point of implementation, enabling a more resilient movement trajectory at the heart of empire." Okay. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate you taking the time to hear all of my ramblings. I hope this was useful to you. Please let me know if it was, especially the stuff around counterinsurgency. Does this kind of analysis help you see counterinsurgency in your own movement efforts? Can it maybe help prevent counterinsurgent operations in your context, wherever you are watching this? I'd be really thrilled to hear about it, honestly, if you want to email me or comment on this video. And yeah, please, help boost this. Presumably YouTube won't be very friendly to this kind of content, so I really depend on you people sharing it also outside of this platform and doing all the things to boost it on this platform, like liking and commenting and subscribing and turning on notifications, etc. Hopefully this video doesn't get thrown off of the internet after I've worked on it for so long. And feel free to support the channel, give a tip if you want to, buy me a coffee or whatever, so I can keep working on this stuff. But most importantly, keep fighting for a free Palestine and to stop the genocide. And I'll see you in the streets. So until next time. It's quite good though, honestly. I mean, you don't need blood for it. It is totally edible as is. Should I just eat the whole thing in front of the camera? This is probably really inappropriate for this video, especially for this section. It's just so good and salty, Why? So that's after. Damn. This is good stuff. Wow. I'm hungry. I've been here for a while. This is my second take. This isn't my studio, and I'm actually not supposed to eat in here. So I'm probably getting in trouble, but I'll just accuse the authorities of anti-Semitism if anything happens.
Quit school because all of you.
That was delicious. Now I have to clean up.